one short by Andrew Harwood. First published in 2026 by the Thompson Newman Files Limited. Copyright 2026. All rights reserved. The snow in Denver fell the way lies do. Quietly and all at once, until the world was unrecognizable. Stephanie Thompson had been a detective for 4 months. She didn't feel like one. She felt like someone who had borrowed the badge and was waiting for the original owner to come back and claim it. She felt like the new furniture in a room that knew all the old arrangements. She felt, in the mornings before coffee and the discipline that coffee enabled, like a fraud wearing the right coat. Stephanie arrived 20 minutes earlier than she needed to. She always did. The squad room was mostly empty. Night shift had handed over and escaped before day shift fully committed to being awake. The coffee machine in the corner made noises suggesting it had lost the will to live sometime during the previous administration. She poured a cup anyway. Frank Carver was already at his desk. He was always already at his desk. Stephanie had never managed to arrive before him and had begun to suspect he simply lived there between shifts. "You own a home?" she asked. Frank didn't look up from the file in front of him. "Several." "Several?" "Monopoly champion, 1987. She sat down. "That's not what I meant." "No," Frank agreed, "but it was funnier." Stephanie drank the coffee. It tasted like a disciplinary matter. Frank finally looked across the desks. "You're here early. So are you. I work here." "So do I." Frank considered this. "Debatable." She pointed at her badge. "I've got one of these. Could be stolen." "You think I stole a detective badge?" "I think if somebody stole a detective badge, it'd probably be you. You'd create a spreadsheet first." Stephanie tried not to smile. Across the room, a pair of detectives were arguing about football. One of them noticed Frank. "Carver." Frank looked up. "Settle something." "No. You haven't heard the question." "Experience suggests I don't need to." The detective pointed at his colleague. "He thinks the Broncos are making the playoffs." Frank looked at both men. "Neither of you should be allowed opinions before breakfast." The argument ended immediately. Stephanie shook her head. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Make people stop." Frank returned to his file. "Practice." She watched him for a moment. 26 years in homicide. Most people carried their experience loudly. Rank pins, stories, photographs, war wounds displayed like trophies. Frank carried his quietly. His desk contained exactly what he needed and nothing he didn't. No awards, no family photographs, no framed certificates. The only personal item was a coffee mug so old the original logo had worn away years ago. "You ever think about retiring?" she asked. Frank stared at her as if she'd asked whether gravity was optional. Why? 26 years. So, most people would want something different. Frank leaned back in his chair. "Kid, let me explain something." Stephanie waited. "Everybody thinks this job is about catching bad people. It isn't. No. What is it about?" Frank nodded toward the evidence board on the far wall. "It's about speaking for people who can't speak anymore." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The squad room seemed quieter. "That's it?" Stephanie asked. "That's it. That's your philosophy? Don't make it sound grand." "It sounds grand." "It isn't." Frank picked up his coffee. "It's paperwork with occasional running." Stephanie laughed. Frank pointed at her with the mug. "Besides." "Besides what?" "You haven't been here long enough yet." "For what?" "To realize something important." She narrowed her eyes. "What important thing?" Frank took a sip. "The dead are easy." "The dead are easy?" "Always." "Frank, that sounds insane." "The living," he said, returning to his file, "are where all the paperwork comes from." Then she looked at the board. The board was the only place where feeling didn't matter. The board had facts on it, photographs, timelines, names and dates, and the cold connective tissue between them. The board was where she was useful, and she knew it, and on bad days she took comfort in the way other people took comfort in things she had never quite understood. Her desk was third from the window. Denver's skyline sat gray and patient behind the glass, the mountains invisible in low cloud. She had been at the desk long enough to claim it. A mug she refused to share, a spare pen holder from the office supply room, a photograph of no one she wanted to explain. She was looking at a name she did not recognize yet, Martin Yardley, age 51. Found in his Commerce City apartment, January 4th, apparent cardiac event, no signs of struggle. Filed and closed by Detective Ruiz 3 weeks prior. Stephanie had not been assigned to Martin Yardley. She had found him in the supplemental case log she had taken to reading on slow mornings, not because anyone asked her to, but because the shape of things interested her. The way one file connected to another, the way detail lay dormant until you held it next to a different detail and saw what it had always been. She had a notebook open beside the keyboard, 3 names in it now. "You're doing it again," Frank Carver said. He said it without looking up from his own desk, which was across from hers and had the organized chaos of a man who knew exactly where everything was and simply didn't care how it looked. "Doing what?" "That thing with the notebook." "I take notes." "You fill notebooks," Frank said. "There's a difference. Normal detectives fill notebooks when there's a case. You fill them in case there's a case." Stephanie looked at her notebook, then at Frank. He was 58, built like someone who had once been considerably larger and had compressed without losing any of the weight. He had a face that had seen everything twice and found it mildly disappointing the second time. All those years in homicide. Never promoted past detective first grade, not because he couldn't, but because he understood something about rank that younger officers didn't. The higher you went, the further from the work. "Sit down," he said. "I am sitting down." "Mentally, I mean." She closed the notebook. "I found a third one." Frank looked up at her then. She slid the folder across the desks. He caught it, opened it, read without expression. "He's the third," Stephanie said. "Ruiz filed it in January. Walsh filed one in October. Chen filed one in August. 3 men, 3 different parts of the city, 3 different causes of death on the first report, but they all share something. Tell me." Something personal was missing. Not valuables, not wallets or watches or the obvious things. Something small. August, Walsh's victim. His daughter said her father never took off the St. Christopher medal her mother gave him. It wasn't on the body, wasn't found in the apartment. Stephanie tapped the folder. October's victim. Walsh's case notes mention a photograph missing from the nightstand. Family confirmed it was always there. His late wife. He slept with it facing him. Frank said nothing. Yardley's sister came in last week for property return. She mentioned a watch. Not expensive. Belonged to their father. Yardley wore it every day. Stephanie paused. It wasn't logged with his effects. Frank was very still. 3 different detectives, she said. 3 different cases. None of them knew to connect it because the missing items were all written off as pre-death misplacement. But it's the same detail, Frank. Same detail, 3 times. He closed the folder. Outside, a city bus pulled away from the stop, its headlights dragging through the gray morning. "You've been reading other people's case files on your own time," he said. "Yes. Mendez won't like that. Mendez won't know unless someone tells him." Frank looked at her the way she'd seen him look at evidence he wasn't sure how to classify. Not dismissal, not belief. Assessment. "How long have you been working this?" he asked. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, he repeated. "On a case you weren't assigned, plus 2 others you also weren't assigned." "Yes." He stood up, taking his mug with him. "Right," he said. "Show me everything." They spent the next 2 days building what they couldn't yet call a case. Frank had a method. He had always had a method, and in 26 years it had served him without exception, which was why Stephanie was careful not to say the word method around him, because she suspected he'd been called methodical enough times to find it condescending. He interviewed, he documented, he cross-referenced. He moved through the procedural architecture of investigation the way a carpenter moves through a familiar house. Not rushing, not wandering, each step deliberate and placed with the economy of long practice. Stephanie moved differently. She read, she connected, she arranged things on paper until they showed her what they were hiding. Between them, it worked. By the second afternoon, they had 3 victims, 3 missing items, 3 cases, and one thread running beneath all of it that no single detective had been in a position to see. The victims had appeared as witnesses in a civil dispute 5 years earlier, not together, not knowingly, but each of them had been called to give statements in a property fraud case that had eventually collapsed without verdict. Their names were buried in a case file most people would have stopped reading. Stephanie had not stopped reading. How many other witnesses were there? Frank asked. She had already counted. 11. 4 deceased by other means, 4 unaccounted for, 3 alive. Frank set his mug down. We need to find the 3 alive. They found 2 of them that evening. The third's phone went to voicemail. His name was Warren Keel. He lived in a neat house in Thornton, north of Denver, and drove a Subaru Outback that he washed on Saturdays, and worked as a contract bookkeeper whose clients described him as precise, reliable, and entirely forgettable. His neighbors knew him the way people know a particular lamppost, by its absence rather than its presence. He was 53 years old, no record, no previous contact with Denver PD. His name did not appear in any system in a way that warranted a second look. That was what made Stephanie's attention settle on him like snow. Too neat, too absent, too careful to be exactly that uninteresting. She kept the thought to herself until she had something more than instinct to offer Frank. She found it in a storage unit. Keel maintained a rental unit at a facility in Commerce City, not far from where Martin Yardley had died. The lease was registered to a name that almost matched his, a single transposed letter in the middle, the sort of error that looks accidental and isn't. She found it by running unusual spelling variations on his name through rental listings, a process she had developed herself and that Frank had once watched in silence before saying only, "That's not standard." "I know," she'd said. "It's effective," he'd added, which was the closest he generally came to a compliment. They went to the captain. Mendez was a practical man who had learned to distinguish between detectives who had something and detectives who thought they had something. He looked at what they'd built, asked 4 questions, and authorized a warrant without drama. "Be careful," he said. Frank said, "Always are." Mendez looked at Stephanie. "I mean both of you." The storage facility was open 24 hours. They arrived at 7 p.m. January 21st. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. The facility sat in a flat gray sprawl of Commerce City. Warehouses, logistics companies, the bleakness of industrial Denver in winter. Unit 41 was in the second row. Corridor C, metal door, padlock, standard. The warrant covered a search. The search took 6 minutes. What was inside took considerably longer to understand. A filing cabinet, neatly organized, 6 labeled folders, photographs, documents, personal effects in sealed evidence bags, self-sealed, fastidious, each labeled with a name and a date, a St. Christopher medal, a photograph of a woman, a watch with a worn leather strap, and 3 folders that were not retrospective. They were prospective. 3 more names. Addresses, routines noted in careful columns, a timeline that began the following week. Stephanie looked at the folders and felt the thing she always felt when a pattern completed itself. Not triumph, exactly. Something more like grief. The pattern had always been there. People had always been in its path. She had simply arrived at the moment when it was finally visible. "Call it in," Frank said. She already had her phone out. Then the light at the end of the corridor changed. Keel came back the way he had lived his life, quietly and at an ordinary hour with no urgency. He was carrying a bag. He had his keys in his hand. He stopped at the entrance to Corridor C and saw them. For a moment, no one moved. Then he ran, not away. Back through the facility's entrance, toward the vehicle entrance at the rear, where the rolling doors opened onto the loading area. "Go," Frank said. They went. The facility at night was a maze of corridors and fluorescent tubes and the smell of cold metal and old cardboard. Keel was fast for his age, and he knew the layout. Stephanie was faster, and Frank had longer legs, and they were closing when Keel turned. He had a weapon, not a firearm, a knife, long, fixed blade, held with the grip of someone who had held it before. He planted himself at the T-junction of corridor C and D with his back to the far wall and the blade at his side. "Stop," Stephanie said. She had her Glock out. Frank had his. Keel looked at them both. His breathing was controlled. His expression was the expression of a man doing arithmetic. "Warren Keel," Frank said. "Denver PD. Put it down." Keel's eyes moved to Stephanie. She kept her sight line clean. Distance maybe 15 feet. Fluorescent light, one tube flickering. Cold concrete smell. The bag had dropped somewhere back in the corridor. "Knife down," she said. "Hands visible. Now." He took a step sideways. She adjusted. "Don't." He took another step. He was moving along the wall toward the corridor junction, where the angle would give him cover. Frank moved to cut off the angle. Keel lunged, not at Frank, at the junction, at the shadow behind it. Stephanie fired. The round hit his left shoulder and turned him, but didn't stop him. He went into the junction corridor, and she went after him with Frank behind her, and the next 30 seconds happened the way these things always happened. Faster than thought, slower than memory. Keel came out of the shadow with the knife still in his right hand and something else in his left, a length of pipe from somewhere in the unit stacks, and he came at her low, and she fired twice, and the pipe glanced off her forearm, and she went into the shelving unit hard enough to see white, and Frank shouted something, and she came back with the Glock up. He was behind a stack of metal shelving. She could hear him breathing. She fired at the movement when it came, twice more, and then there was a pause that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and felt like a conversation. She counted her rounds without consciously deciding to. She didn't like what she got. Frank moved left. She moved right. Keel came through the shelving, literally through it, shoulder first, scattering boxes, and he came at her with the knife in a tight arc, and she stepped back and fired. Hit, again, hit. He was on his knees. He should have been done. He was not done. She fired again. The slide locked back. The gun was empty. She knew it, the difference in the trigger, the absence of resistance. And for 1 second that lasted considerably longer than a second, she looked at Warren Keel on his knees with the knife still in his hand, and she looked at the locked-back slide of her Glock 19, and she understood exactly what she didn't have. One more round. That was all. One more round, and it was over. She reached for her spare magazine. It was on the ground behind her. It had come off her belt when the pipe connected. She saw it in the flat fluorescent light, 4 feet away, and she calculated the distance and the time, and she already knew. Frank Carver stepped in front of her. She said his name. He said, "Stay back." Keel rose. Not all the way. Enough. The knife was still in his hand, and his eyes had the emptiness of a man who had already done the arithmetic and found it acceptable. "Frank." "Magazine," Frank said. Calm. Completely calm, the way he always was. "Get the magazine." She moved for it. She heard the shot, not hers. Frank's, fired at Keel. And then Keel's knife found Frank's side in the same half-second, in the way that sometimes two things happen simultaneously that were never supposed to be simultaneous, and Frank went down against the corridor wall, and she had the magazine in her hand. She looked at Frank. She looked at Keel. Keely was raising the knife. She dropped the Glock. No time. And her right hand went to her ankle and came up with the Ruger, and she fired once. Warren Keel sat down on the concrete floor of Corridor C and did not get up again. She called it in. Then she went to Frank. He was sitting against the wall with both hands pressed to his left side and the expression of a man who has been here before and is not surprised to find himself here again. The blood was dark. Too dark, too fast. "Frank, I'm all right. You're not. Relatively all right." He glanced at Keel. "He down?" "Yes." "Breathing?" "Yes." Frank closed his eyes briefly. "Good. Case needs him breathing." She had her hands over his. "Don't talk." "I'm going to talk. What else am I going to do?" Somewhere outside, a siren. Early. Someone had heard the shots. "You emptied it," Frank said. "Yes." "I've seen you on the range. You don't usually empty it." It was a confined space. He kept moving. He opened his eyes. They were steady. She had always liked that about him. that his eyes told the truth about what he was feeling, and what he was feeling was never less than what the situation required. "You'll get a bigger magazine next time." She said nothing. "Not a criticism," he said, "just a fact. You'll look at what you carried and you'll ask what would have been different, and the answer will be 2 more rounds in the magazine. So you'll get a bigger magazine." "Frank, stop talking. I'm trying to be useful. You're bleeding." "Simultaneously," he said, and despite everything she almost laughed, which was exactly what he intended. The sirens were closer. She kept her hands on his. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You saw it, didn't you? Months ago. You saw the shape of it before any of us." "I saw something." "You saw it," he said. "Those 3 people in the Prospective Files. You got to them before he did." She didn't answer. "That's not nothing, Stephanie." She knew it wasn't nothing. She also knew it wasn't enough. She was very tired of knowing both things at once. "Paramedics are coming," she said. "I know. You're going to be fine." Frank looked at her. His eyes were still steady, still honest. He didn't say anything. She understood what that meant. She had always been good at patterns. "You're going to be fine," she said again, "because some things you say not because you believe them, but because the alternative is a silence you're not ready for." Frank squeezed her hands once. Then the paramedics came through the door, and everything became noise and light, and the organized chaos of people who know how to work fast, and Stephanie stood back and let them in, and kept her eyes on Frank Carver's face until she couldn't see it anymore. Frank Carver died at 11:42 p.m. on January 21st at Denver Health Medical Center. She was in the waiting room when they told her. A doctor, a nurse, a hospital chaplain who stood slightly behind the other 2 in case he was needed. She noted the formation without meaning to. She noted everything without meaning to. It was the thing she couldn't turn off. She thanked the doctor. She sat in the waiting room for another hour before she trusted herself to drive. The Toyota 4Runner started on the 3rd attempt. The heater came on reluctantly, distributing lukewarm air with the half-hearted effort of something that had been asked too many times. She sat in the hospital car park with the engine running and the city lights blurred through the windscreen, and she did not cry because crying was something she had always done privately and alone, and she was not alone. A patrol officer was standing by the exit waiting to escort her home, department protocol after an officer-involved shooting, and she was aware of him the way she was aware of everything. She drove home. She thanked the patrol officer. She went inside. She did not sleep. Warren Keel survived. His injuries required surgery, 4 days in hospital under guard, and a recovery that the nursing staff reportedly found uncomplicated, which Stephanie noted and did not comment on. He was transferred to Denver County Jail. He was charged on 3 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and a list of additional charges that the DA's office assembled with evident thoroughness. He did not speak during his arraignment. He looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man solving a problem no one else could see. She had to be in the room. Procedure required it. She looked at him twice. Both times, he was already looking at her. She did not look a 3rd time. The commendation ceremony was held on a Thursday in February. The room was warm and properly lit and full of people in good clothes who shook her hand and said her name correctly and told her she'd done something extraordinary. Captain Mendez stood beside her. The chief spoke. A city council member she didn't recognize said things about Denver and safety and the kind of courage that protected communities. She stood straight and received it all with the correct expression. The medal was a weight in her hand she hadn't expected. Not physically. It was small, standard issue for the honor, nothing extraordinary. But it landed in her palm and stayed there. And she looked at it and thought about Frank Carver saying 2 more rounds in the magazine with his hands pressed to his side in Corridor C. She thought he should be standing here. She thought he would hate this. He would stand here anyway. He would make a joke afterward quietly to her alone, something dry and precise that only landed if you knew him. She thought, I know him. I knew him. She accepted the medal. She shook the chief's hand. She drove home in the 4Runner, which had decided this morning was not for the heater working properly, and she sat in her apartment with the metal on the kitchen table and a coffee going cold beside it, and she looked at neither of them for a long time. Mendez called her into his office the following week. He had a way of sitting at his desk that suggested the desk was a formality he tolerated for administrative reasons. He gestured at the chair across from him, and she sat. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Fine." He looked at her. "Try again." She said nothing. He nodded. "The DA's office is comfortable with the evidence. Keel's trial date will be set within the month. They're going for consecutive life terms." He paused. "He's not getting out." "I know." "You saved 3 people," Mendez said. "The names in those prospective files. 3 people are alive because you pulled that thread." She had told herself the same thing enough times to know it was true. It was also insufficient, and she suspected it would always be insufficient, and she had decided to make peace with the insufficiency rather than argue with it. "Frank taught me to check the case logs," she said. "He used to say closed cases talk. You just have to listen." Mendez was quiet for a moment. "He was right about you." She didn't ask what he'd said. "He put it in your quarterly review," Mendez said. "Last October, he wrote..." He opened a file. "Thompson sees structure where others see noise. Given the right case and the right time, she'll be exceptional. I'm not sure the department will deserve her." Stephanie looked at the window. Denver sat in thin winter sunlight, the mountains finally visible, white and indifferent above the grid of the city. She thought about the space across from her desk where Frank had sat for 4 months and had been, in those 4 months, the closest thing she had found in homicide to someone who made sense. "All right," she said, because there was nothing else to say, and Frank would have agreed. She stood up. "Stephanie." She stopped. "He was right," Mendez said, "but you deserved him too." She nodded once. Then she went back to her desk and opened the case logs and kept listening. She requested a Glock 17 after that. She told the armory it was a preference issue. She did not elaborate. Her request was denied. But in the years that followed, and there were many of them, full of other cases and other corridors and other moments when the arithmetic of a situation came down to what you had in your hand and whether it was enough, she never forgot the difference. 17 rounds in a Glock 17, 2 more than her current 15, a number so small it should have been irrelevant. It wasn't. In the quiet moments, which were rarer than people supposed and more necessary than she liked to admit, she would think about Frank Carver, about the steadiness in his eyes in Corridor C, about the magazine on the floor between her and what she needed, about the economy of a man who had spent 26 years making himself useful and found, in the end, one last way to be. She did not consider it a debt she could repay. She considered it a reason to keep working. Every time a case tasted wrong, every time the pattern was there and no one else was looking, every time the board showed her something that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to read it, she thought of him, and she kept reading.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. I'm building a thriller universe called the Thompson-Newman Files, and there are many more stories still to come. Until next time, remember, T before tactics.